broadcasting live from the School of Athens. This is Europe and the People Without History with Mr. Olson, everyone's favorite AP World History Review service. So today we're going to take a stab at talking about imperialism in China and the Middle East in the early and mid 1800s. This, of course, can also be talked about in the name of the Chinese and Ottoman responses to industrialization, but then, of course, that hides the fact that imperialism is the key to the entire topic. Now, you might be issued a long essay in your class that asks you to discuss the differences in or similarities in which the Chinese or the Qing Empire and the Ottomans responded to economic change. And so this is just a reminder of how you might set up that essay. You have a historical context and a thesis in your introduction, and then you have body paragraphs based on what was similar and what was different. And then in the end, you would argue whether it was more similar or more different, and what the consequences of those historical decisions by the Ottoman and the Qing would be. So let's go ahead and get this started. We're going to start in the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. So this is just a review, or let's contextualize the Ottoman real quick. The Ottomans were nomads. The empire was started by a man named Osman Bey, who was a descendant of Turco-Mongolian nomads. And of course, this developed after Osman Bey decided to settle down into the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire really makes waves when Mehmed the Conqueror, Mehmed II, conquers Constantinople in 1453, thus cementing the Ottoman presence in Anatolia and Southwest Asia. After him, the most important Ottoman Sultan is going to be Suleiman the Magnificent, who's very famous for expanding the Ottoman borders further than they had been before, but also imposing a pretty well-known law system, which gave Suleiman the nickname the Lawgiver. The Ottomans are also well known for instituting the Devshirme, which is where they kidnapped and or took Christian boys from predominantly the Balkans and turned them into eunuchs, but then loyal soldiers, and eventually who became janissaries. Now, the Christian boys who were in this Devshirme system could also rise up and become viziers and high-ranking government officials, so it was bad, but I guess it wasn't all bad. Anyways, last time that we, in my course at least, left the Ottoman Empire, Napoleon showed up and stared the Sphinx straight in its place where a nose once was. What does this indicate? Well, it indicates, of course, that the Ottoman must be sort of crumbling on the outskirts if France was able to walk into Egypt and conquer it. But remember, Napoleon found the Rosetta Stone, so I guess in the West, that means it's all good, right? Not really. But this is important because the Ottoman Empire is now a shell of its former self. If you can see the background of that screen, the black line is the furthest expanse of the Ottoman Empire at its height, and as time goes on, especially into the 1800s, that's going to be chipped away at again and again and again. Now, I will point out that the Ottomans control this part of the world, known as the Balkans, in and around the Mediterranean, and controlling that part of the world can cause some potential issues because there are a lot of different national identities and or nationalistic affiliations in that part of the world. Now, that means that the Ottomans are in control of the Greeks, they are in control of Albanians, they are in control of Bosnians, Croatians, they are in control of Slovenians, and as a result of that, there's a lot of dissent being sort of conjured up towards the Ottomans during this time period. Now, eventually, the Greeks are going to get this party started in the 1820s, agitating for and then eventually achieving their independence, and other places in the Balkans will follow. Now, this is an opportunity for me to take a step back or take a moment and review. There are important Islamic cities in the world, one of which was controlled by the Ottoman Empire, and that, of course, would be the capital of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople. That changes its name to Istanbul after being conquered by the Ottomans. But perhaps you remember the city that was conquered by Muhammad. Perhaps you remember the intellectual capital of the Muslim world during the Middle Ages. Perhaps you remember the city of gold in the Mali Empire. Those, of course, would be Mecca, Baghdad, or Cordoba, whichever one you want to choose, and Timbuktu. So Islamic cities have played a prevalent role in the development of this civilization for a long time. Now, as we said, the Ottoman Empire is a shell of its former self. And on the outskirts of that empire, and we're going to take Egypt as the case study here, there starts to emerge various leaders that are more loyal to their locality. So in this case, Muhammad Ali is an Egyptian guy, and he is loyal to people in Egypt. He's actually born in the Balkans, and I think the Albanians claim him. But anyways, he's, for our purposes, from Egypt, and he's more loyal to people in Egypt than he is to the Sultan. Now, because the Ottoman Empire is kind of crumbling, they give autonomy to places in the outskirts. So Muhammad Ali is given a sort of autonomy in Egypt, even though it's still kind of a part of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, now Ali decides he is going to reform Egypt. He institutes conscription, which means that males will be mandated to be into the army whenever there calls a need for them. That also Ali is going to impose a number of Western goals and put Egypt on the path to industrialization. The quintessential example of this is the building of the Suez Canal, which is a man-made river that connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. Now, this becomes known as the lifeline of Europe because what it does is it allows the Europeans to bypass having to go all the way around Africa and go through the Suez Canal and therefore from the Mediterranean Sea into the Indian Ocean very easily. And since all that trade was in the Indian Ocean and China, this cut Europe's trading destination time in half, or even more than that. This becomes a pretty big deal. Now, the Suez Canal is funded predominantly by British and French interests, which means that when it opens in 1869, Britain and France lay claim to it. And it won't be for a long while, 100 years in fact, until the people of Egypt will nationalize this canal. And as you can possibly imagine, when they nationalize the canal, Britain and France are not going to like it. Nevertheless, that's 100 years, and decolonization, we're talking about the beginning of it here. So, Suez Canal indicates that Egypt and the reforms that are put in place by Muhammad Ali, not that Muhammad Ali, are going to set Egypt on a path towards industrialization. So on the outskirts, seems as though they're going to embrace it. Industrialization. Now let's talk about what's happening more closer to the heart of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans, in response to pressure that is put on them by industrialization on the outside, start to reorganize their empire. So in the mid-1800s, they pass a series of reforms called the Tanzimat Reforms. These are focused on things like laws and education and changes in the military. Now, you can sit and look at all the Tanzimat reforms if you want to and try and decide which was most important, and I might encourage you to do that, right? So, for example, there is an establishment of Academy of Science. There is non-Muslims are allowed to become soldiers. We're going to replace guilds with factories, so moving away from a more feudal way of doing things to a more industrial way of doing things. There is something on here about establishing a post office, but I'm not going to look at it here. But look, they abolished the slave trade. All of these are Enlightenment principles. So the Ottomans are actually adopting a lot of the Western strategies to move in motion in industrialization or modernization process. Check out their Modernized Troops. It looked like a outfitted group of professional soldiers. Now, one of the things that they institute is the fez cap, because this would allow troops to pray by putting their head on the ground, because in the Islamic religion, that, as it happens, is a pillar, no pun intended. Now, in addition to these reforms, the Ottomans, despite trying to hang on for dear life by sort of, making themselves a little bit more like the West, they experience a series of shocks. So as I indicated before, first Greece, then other places in the Balkans, and then smaller land holdings. This, of course, is going to lead to internal dissension within the empire and cause it to become more and more unstable over time. This leads to the Ottomans being dubbed by the rest of Europe sort of the sick man of Europe. And you can see is indicated by this cartoon right here. So the Ottomans, once a strong, multi-ethnic empire, is starting to feel the weight of outside pressures. Now, this is going to come to a boiling point in 1853 when the Ottomans and the Russians fight over a little piece of land called Crimea right here in the Black Sea. Why is it important to the Ottomans? Well, land at this point in their declining empire is important to them. Why is it important to the Russians? Well, the Russians need warm water ports, and this is an opportunity for them to have one. And for between 1853 and 1854, the Ottomans and the Russians fight a brutal and bitter war that is sort of infiltrated by the Western powers. Now, in this battle, it might surprise you to note that the Allies, or France and Britain, take the side of the Ottomans. Why would two Christian European nations, and predominantly France is driving this, and France is a Catholic nation, why would a Catholic nation side with an Islamic empire? Well, it's kind of complicated, but take this as your easiest answer. The Ottomans are on the decline in terms of their power in the region, and France, feeling the need to resurrect their once great standing in the world, see an opportunity to jump into this part of the world and mop up some land and power for themselves. So they see an opportunity to back the Ottomans and then benefit from the spoils of war. Whereas the Russians, because of their westernization efforts and expansion that they had endured in their beginnings of industrialization, seem to be the bigger threat in the moment. So that is why Britain and France will take the side of the Ottomans. Now, the Russians are humiliated in this war. Britain and France help make sure that the Ottomans win. But the Ottomans don't get much of the benefits from the war the British and the French do. Russia, humiliated, and that's the reason that they need to kick their industrialization efforts into overdrive, which is something that you either have talked about or might talk about later. Now, the Crimean War is often considered one of the first modern wars in that it used modern technology with really old techniques. So like soldiers with better rifles would stand across the battlefield from one another and shoot and kill way more than they used to. But nevertheless, if you look at this graph, you will note that in the Crimean War, most of the death came not from guns, but disease. Why did it come from disease? Well, the troops were not taken very good care of. Fatigue and famine ravaged armies. There was also some really questionable medical techniques that were used. For example, perhaps you've heard of Dr. Lister. Yeah, he, of course, is a doctor that went on the amputation spree, cut off everything, right? And so in 2.5 minutes, he amputated someone's leg, but in the enthusiasm, amputated the person's testicles as well. Scary. Now, Liston's second or most famous case, he amputated almost every single part of a person. I'm just going to leave that right there. This was also the doctor who is well known for sticking his fingers into the back of President James Garfield and making what could have been a livable wound into a fatal one. Now, while Dr. Lister is doing some crazy things and diseases are killing a lot of people, it's also important to note that women play an important role in this war. They've played an important role in all wars, don't get me wrong, but in this one they're memorialized because Florence Nightingale, a British nurse, goes to the battlefield and helps treat the sick and hurt. And this is something that Clara Barton will make popular in the United States, but Florence Nightingale sort of blazes that trail. Now, in addition to the Tanzimat reforms, you now have the Crimean War, which sort of nudges the Ottomans into modernizing even further. So they modernized their banking sector by making it look more like the Western one in terms of investments and markets and supporting industrialization. Also, the Ottomans begin to secularize, and this causes former government officials and Islamic scholars to get very, very mad. Women are allowed roles in Ottoman society as a result of the Tanzimat reforms that they weren't allowed previously, and this also makes some conservative Islamic scholars and clerics very upset. So now we start to see agitation happening between those who used to be in power and this new set of Ottoman political figures. Now, eventually, these things and this tension within the government, mixed with the Crimean War and the fact that they're industrializing late, will help lead to Europe economic decline and Europe coming in to save the Ottomans. The Europeans come in and they make a deal with the Ottomans known as extraterritoriality, which is an instance in which the Europeans basically lay claim to various places within the Ottoman Empire and claim the right to act however they please on those areas. Now, this, of course, makes people within the Ottoman Empire very upset, and that, in addition to a series of other what we call capitulations, or basically deals that the Ottomans make with the Europeans, make a lot of former Ottoman government officials and, like we said, Islamic clerics and conservative scholars mad. Now, in an effort to preserve Ottoman autonomy, there is a group that emerges called the Young Turks who seek to battle and or fight against this European incursion. They will come up later when, of course, the Ottoman Empire disintegrates and various nation states emerge. One more thing about the Ottomans, and I'm going to go back to this because I forgot to say it. You look at their new modernized troops. If Ottoman troops are modernized now, guess what we don't have anymore? No more Janissaries, which means a once great gunpowder empire is now giving way to modern warfare. Well, there's the Ottomans. Let's go ahead and take a look at the Qing Empire and their responses to industrialization, which will involve some drugs. So you might remember we last left China in the midst of the Ming Empire, where they had sent the famous explorer Zheng He off to the world. Now this, of course, resulted in the Ming deciding that they were going to isolate themselves, and for a period of 200 years or so, they isolated themselves from the rest of the world, rebuilt the Great Wall, and sort of tried to just make it on their own. China is able to do that, however, as most Chinese empires do, eventually the Ming fall victim to famine and natural disasters and poor government rulings and a peasant uprising that will result in outsiders, known as the Qing, coming to power. Now, the Qing are Manchus, so they're nomads from the north, and so this is a period of outside rule in China, which of course never goes over well. However, the Qing were more willing than the previous Mongols to take on Chinese characteristics, with the exception of their queue ponytails, and that allowed them to be a little bit more benevolent rulers, and therefore they were accepted more readily than the Mongols were. Now, during the period of the Qing, the Chinese economy becomes proto-industrial, meaning that they're making things for foreign markets, they're mass producing them, but they're not necessarily as immersed into the world economy as, say, England would be at the beginning of their industrial revolution. Now, if we are going to talk about the Qing and eventually the Qing's downfall, we have to at least remind ourselves of the other Chinese dynasties.
One Qing Republic, one Qing Republic, Mao Zedong, Mao Zedong.
All right, you get the point. Okay, so anyways, under the period of the Qing, you can see that the population in China skyrockets, which means that they have utilized new agricultural techniques and various other mechanisms to increase the population tremendously. This will also have impacts on the economy. They will become more urbanized, and they will be sort of on the precipice to involve themselves in world affairs. Now, there's a standard narrative here whereby England shows up and tries to force China open, and as the story goes, the guy who the British Admiral Lord Macartney shows up, and the Qianlong Emperor, or the Emperor of the Qing, wants him to kowtow, and Lord Macartney refuses, and as a result of that, the Qianlong Empire tells him to get lost and go away, and China reverts back into isolation. This, though, is a story that has been questioned recently, and I would encourage you to look for this article, Lord Macartney, China and the Convenient Lies of History. It does a really good job of explaining that that story might have just been made up in an effort to paint the Chinese as different, other, and to be scorned by the West. Did the Qianlong Empire really emphasize the kowtow? Actually, the historical record shows no. So this is just made up. Rather, we should look at it as the Chinese not necessarily wanting British goods because they had everything that they already needed. China has all in abundance. Britain getting mad and then needing to figure out a way to force themselves in to China. Now, what they end up doing is they need to find something that China wants because China has the bulk of the world's money, because Britain bought a stupid amount of tea. And as a result of that, the British stumble upon opium, which they start selling to China in large, large numbers. Because the opium epidemic is causing such problems in China, the Chinese seek to throw off this yoke of narcotic oppression, but when they do, the British respond negatively and force opium on the Chinese after 2 wars that the Chinese then have to sign a humiliating treaty to open themselves up to Western influence. Now, before I talk to you about that, it's important to note that China tried, and they had a government official named the Incorruptible Commissioner Lin, who told the British it's time to go, wrote a famous letter to Queen Victoria, said, "Why do your people push drugs on mine?" and dumped a bunch of opium into the sea. That made the British mad, and then the British came for retribution, and that is why we get an Opium War. But just to give you an idea, this is how the French portrayed it. Of course, the French aren't going to like the fact that the British are doing this because the French, usually don't get along with the British, says a guy who just talked about how they were allies during the Crimean War, but you understand nuance. But you can see that opium dens started to show up in huge numbers throughout China. It was insane. And law historians have looked at how many cases were brought about, and the numbers just skyrocket. Most of the Chinese courts were dealing with opium, not with other issues in society. It literally took over everything. When the Chinese said no more, the British sailed their industrially superior ships into and up to the Chinese coast and into the Chinese mainland, into the rivers, and as a result win 2 opium wars in the 1830s and 40s. Now, after the second one, they signed the Treaty of Nanking, which forces the Chinese to open up what we call spheres of influence. Basically, areas in which Europeans are now allowed to trade freely in China. Remember, they could only trade at Canton at one point, and now, as you can see, Europe is carving up this one great nation. As it might be indicated by this one, China, the very strong, once mighty dragon, is being slayed by a series of European powers. So here I ask you this question. Should England have a right to freely trade opium? Ha! Anyways, now this shows China that they might have a problem on their hands that needs addressing. They need to figure out a way to deal with this encroaching Western power. And so they start to pass reforms that, like the Ottomans, make themselves a little bit more and more amenable to the West. Now, this causes havoc in the more conservative Confucian areas of China. And in the 1850s, there is going to be one Chinese man who thinks that he met Jesus and then decides that he is going to go on a crusade for this against the Chinese government and sets off the Taiping Rebellion. Now, the Qing ask for help from the West to put down this Taiping Rebellion, which kind of sows the seeds for the future. Now, if I were to look at the most bloody conflicts in all of history, the Taiping Rebellion that took place between 1851 and 1864 is the most deadly in terms of highest estimates. That's how destructive this rebellion was. And it kind of gave us an idea of things that might come. In response to this, China and the fact that they had to humiliatingly ask for help and the fact that they had to sign humiliating treaties decided that it was time for them to reform, and they pass a series of reforms known as the self-strengthening movement. This involves concessions to the West, but also various new laws and decisions that put China on the direction of becoming more and more like those Western powers. Now, this is going to make conservative Confucians mad, as we just saw with the Taiping Rebellion. And in the late 1890s, an empress is going to come to power, Empress Cixi, who is not happy about this. Okay, and as a result, she starts to unravel some of these self-strengthening reforms. She then becomes a great model or a great symbol for those in China who feel like they're being taken advantage of by the West. Nevertheless, China finds itself involved in a war with the westernizing and industrializing Japan in the 1890s, and they lose that war. And it sort of just goes on to show how humiliatingly behind the times the Chinese are with regard to industrialization. Now, in 1900, as foreigners are forcing themselves into China more and more, and there's sort of elements or threads of Xixi's conservatism sort of lingering, there's a massive anti-foreigner revolt in 1900 1901 called the Boxer Rebellion. It's called the Boxer Rebellion because the leaders of this revolt are members of the so-called Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. But anyways, it is intensely anti-Western. Now, as you can possibly imagine, the British and the United States, by the way, future President Herbert Hoover was here extracting minerals from China, no doubt, and he was involved in this and escaped narrowly to save his life. Now, this indicates to the rest of the world that China will not be brought down easily as long as the Qing dynasty exists. So now enlightened folk in China and enlightened folk outside of China start to clamor for a governmental change. And in 1911, the last Chinese emperor will abdicate the throne and will see the initiation of a Chinese republic led by an enlightened reformer named Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen is well known for beginning this Chinese republic, and he was really an influential man, but he didn't necessarily live long enough to see through his ideals. He wanted to govern based on three principles: democracy, nationalism, and livelihood. He saw the nationalist potential of this message and as a result wanted to put it into China, but there was a lot that had to be done as the Chinese dynastic cycle had lasted for 2,000 years. How's the rest of the world treating the Chinese during this time of turmoil? Well, many Chinese people leave and they become migrants in an effort to try and find stability. So they leave and they go to places like India, like South Africa, like Southeast Asia, or the East Indies. They also come to America, and when they're done building the Transcontinental Railroad, America passes a series of laws called the Chinese Exclusion Acts, which bar Chinese entrance to America for the foreseeable future. They would be in place from 1881 until 1964. Nevertheless, as a result of the discrimination, Chinese people in America decide to settle in ethnic enclaves as a result of ongoing discrimination, and that's why you have so many Chinatowns. Now, in many other places, the Chinese find themselves as indentured servants, so even when they migrate, things don't necessarily always end up well for them. But I want to end with this question. Is the Chinese Exclusion Act anti-American? For that, I think your answer will say more about you than it will the Chinese Exclusion Act, but it definitely says a lot about America. And that's all the time we have for today. This is your Buddha, signing off.